Hello my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 character building guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're covering every single multi-class build in Baldur's Gate. That's right, we're going to go over every single possible combination of two character classes, discuss the strengths and weaknesses of those multi-class builds, how they fit into a party, why you want to fit them into a party, and what those two classes do for one another when you put them into a build. I'll also talk about class combinations that require 3 or more classes, just kind of as we go through, though for the most part this is going to be focusing on pairs of classes because that's the most common multi-class scenario. There are 66 possible multi-class combinations in Baldur's Gate. Each class has 11 possible combinations, but as we go through those combinations, of course, we have already done one of them. So when we do Barbarian combinations, there are 11 combinations with Barbarian, then we'll go through and do Bard combinations, there will be 11 combinations with Bard, but we'll already have covered the combination with Barbarian and Bard. So we'll get fewer per base class as we go through the combinations. 66 is a lot, but I think we can cover all of them and do them all justice. So I decided to do this because, me, feature creep, just maximalist character building guides is the way that we're going. So let's talk about how we're going to be rating these classes. I'm going to be judging them based on essentially 3 metrics. One is, of course, the raw power level of these class combinations. How much power do they bring to your honor mode party? Are they capable of dishing out massive damage or enormous amounts of control? Basically, in its optimal form, how good is this character class combination? 2 is how versatile is it? How many different builds can you make with this combination? How easy is it to fit in a party? Do they demand specific items or specific story choices in order to function appropriately? So, in other words, how easy is it to get it into that optimal configuration in which it has the highest possible power level? And 3 is how forgiving is it to actually play? If you make play mistakes, and honor mode represents hundreds of hours of inputs over the course of a playthrough, so it's very likely that some players, and as I say, obviously not you, but some players will make play mistakes over the course of their playthrough. It's very important to be able to recover from those play mistakes, because sometimes you might be playing while tired, or after a long day of work, or having had a beer, or whatever. So, how forgiving a class combination is very important, I think, to judging how successful it is in an honor mode playthrough, and that's another important metric we're going to take into consideration when we're talking about these multi-class combinations. So here's how we're actually going to do this. I'm going to go through and place each character in turn in the paired class tier at the top here, and then I will rate combinations of multi-classes with that character in the various tiers. So for example, if I thought that Barbarian and Bard was a very bad class combination, I might place Bard in D tier with Barbarian in paired class, and that will show you that I think that class combination is weak. For the actual tiers themselves, we are going to go with 5 different splits. In S tier, I have multi-class combinations that are excellent. These are core builds. Often they are ones that you're going to see build guides for on my channel. They are builds that are going to be very smooth rides through honor mode, and usually have multiple different ways that you can build them and construct powerful and viable characters. In A tier, I have builds that are either extremely powerful or extremely versatile, so they give you either a ton of raw power, but maybe are a little bit harder to fit into your party because of item requirements, maybe have fewer ways you can construct the level splits and stuff, or extremely versatile, they fit into any party, but maybe give you less raw power than the S tier characters. In B tier, solid multi-class combinations. These will patch the weaknesses of the other class very well and give you just an excellent boost to your characters. Often these will be classes without any particular synergy, but ones with just very good raw power early game. An example of this would be a 1-level Cleric dip is good for basically every character, so it would be very hard for a Cleric 1 X11 class to be worse than a B tier class, just because Cleric gives you so much stuff. In C tier, I have niche builds that are basically, you can build this 2-class combination in one specific way, and that way may not be necessarily as good as some of the other ways. Still definitely playable character combinations, but they are ones that are sort of restricted to a single build, and if I've done a build guide for that build, then I will mention what video it shows up in on my channel, so you can go check out that build as you go through this. And in D tier, classes with no particular synergy, so you're just weakening the strengths of one of the two classes if you try to combine those two levels. So those builds are going to tend to not actually be very good. Also, just as a reminder, I have done class tier lists for the monoclass classes already. So for every single class, I did a tier list for the monoclass version of that class, where you take 12 levels of the same class, and then I did it again for every single possible subclass. So if you want information on the base classes and subclasses, there is extremely detailed information available in those two tier lists, so you can have a good foundation to understand what I'm talking about when I start talking about these multi-classes. Also, before I begin, I have a couple quick thank yous to give out. I want to say thank you so much to Travis Rogers for the $20 donation, and to Busani Lucas, Brett Vickers, and Andres Wagner for becoming channel members. Thank you so much, my friends. I really do appreciate it, and let me know if I messed up any of your names, and if so, I do apologize. Alright, without any further ado, let's jump in and start rating the multi-classes. We'll begin by talking about Barbarian, and just as a reminder for those of you who skipped the intro, what I'm doing here is I'm placing one of the classes in the paired class column at the top here, and then the second class that I place in one of these tiers is the tier that I think that multi-class combination goes in. So if I place Bard in a tier here, that's how good I think a Bard-Barbarian multi-class combination is. Barbarian is the class that I think, other than Rogue, suffered the most in my previous tier lists from being restricted to monoclass. Barbarian is an extremely powerful class with great class features, many of which come quite early in the levels that you get Barbarian with. So it's one of the classes that benefits the most from multiclassing with other characters. It has very high highs and very low lows, so the ability to patch those weaknesses and also remove some of the more dead levels from Barbarian by adding in multiclass possibilities is very useful for a Barbarian class and powers up the class significantly. Some of the strongest pushback I got on that class tier list was, I think, by people who were just unable to distinguish between a multiclass Barbarian and a monoclass Barbarian, by the way. We'll start by the pair of multiclass Barbarian and Bard. This is an odd combination, the Bard-Barbarian, because normally Barbarians pair very poorly with spellcasters, since Barbarians have Rage, and that's their signature mechanic. One of the main reasons that you would pick a Barbarian in the first place is to go into a Rage, and Rage, of course, prevents you from concentrating on or casting spells. So when you pair a Barbarian with a spellcaster, you're giving up all the spellcasting or not entering Rage in some fights, meaning that the Barbarian and spellcasters have pretty strong anti-synergy. However, there's actually still some interesting things that you get from pairing Barbarians with spellcasters. One is just the ability to be really tanky, which is very powerful, and two is unarmored defense, because you can then be in a robe while having your AC be very high, because you get the unarmored defense from Constitution. Most spellcasters will want pretty high constitutions anyways, and so a level of Barbarian can replace Mage Armor in giving you a pretty significant boost to your AC with the right equipment, and also giving you Constitution saving throws when you begin with Barbarians, because they get Strength and Con saves as their default saves. That's less useful for a Bard multi-class combination, though, because Bards already get light armor, and so you aren't gaining that much from the Barbarian levels with your Bard in general, other than just some additional hit points. You can build a Rage-focused build that focuses on melee using Swords Bard and Barbarian. However, the issue with that is that Barbarians already get the AoE attack that melee Swords Bards get from Tiger Barbarian. So if you want that AoE attack, you already have access to it. You're not really adding that much by adding in Swords Bard, and Rage doesn't apply to ranged damage, so the ranged Swords Bard variant doesn't gain any additional abilities from having Barbarian in it. All in all, these two classes do not pair terribly well together, although I will say that one level of Bard is just great for just about any class in general. So if you just start with a level of Bard, you get access to all the skills, you get access to great dialogue skills, you get access to a couple nice utility options like Inspiration Dice and Healing Word, even though you will typically be entering Rage. If you want your Barbarian to be a party face, being a Bard is not a terrible way to start that. You get a bunch of dialogue skills and whatever, so I'm going to put this in the niche tier, just because I think that you can make a party-face Barbarian by combining it with Bard. Not a build that I would recommend in terms of the power level, but one that is totally reasonable. Generally speaking, if you want to combine these two characters, you probably want one level of Bard and then a bunch of levels of Barbarian plus other martial classes in order to fill this out. You generally will not be focusing on the spellcasting varieties of Bard, and probably for the most part, if that is your goal, you're better off going with Rogue, who gets all of the same stats and combines extremely well with Barbarian, which we'll talk about later. But I don't think that this build is terrible or anything. Just adding in one level of Bard is never bad, so it's pretty hard for this multi-class combination to be totally worthless. Barbarian Clerics. This is another build that seems at first like there would be no synergy at all between these two classes, but actually either class I think can benefit pretty reasonably from one level of the other class. You generally won't want to pair these two classes in sort of more than one level of each of them. It's going to be like an 11-1 split or something like that, or in the case of Barbarian, probably one level of Cleric and then a few levels of Barbarian, a few levels of another martial class. But the thing that adding one level of Barbarian to your Cleric gives you, if you start with your level of Barbarian at level 1, you get Constitution save proficiency, which is pretty useful, and importantly, and very easy to overlook, you get Perception proficiency. Clerics normally don't get that, but they're a Wisdom-based class, so having proficiency in perception on your Cleric means that they're going to be making the perception checks very reliably. That's actually quite useful. It's a niche benefit, but it's definitely something that's worth paying attention to. In the other direction, one level of Cleric, especially War Cleric, can pair extremely well with Barbarian, getting you all of the utility that Cleric normally gives you. Obviously, you get heavy armor and shields and weapon proficiencies, which are somewhat wasted on a Barbarian, because you'll probably be in medium armor, you may or may not be using a shield, and would have proficiency with it anyways, and the spellcasting that you get from Clerics at level 1 is good, but not something that the Barbarian's going to make extensive use of. It's still nice to have Healing Word, but given that your bonus action is going to be taken up by Raging, and then you'll be Raging and not able to cast the Healing Word, it's not going to come up that frequently. But what you do get from Cleric is just a solid set of utility, and you also get, with War Cleric, an additional bonus action attack every single turn. If you're not a Berserker Barbarian, excuse me, not every turn. A few times, once per turn, but a few times per day. If you're not a Berserker Barbarian, this bonus action attack can be extremely valuable, especially because it works just fine with the special action attacks that the Wildheart Barbarians get. A Tiger Barbarian with War Cleric can make an extra Tiger swing every turn, which, as long as you don't run out of War Cleric charges, which is extremely powerful in and of itself. You also get, and this is another thing that's a very minor, seems like a minor benefit and easy to overlook, but it's actually pretty useful. Cleric gives you Thaumaturgy, which lets you get advantage on intimidation checks. Barbarians get a lot of unique intimidation checks throughout the game, and so having Thaumaturgy, even with relatively low charisma, and getting advantage on those checks, plus guidance, because you'll be a Cleric, so you'll have guidance, probably from another party member, because you won't be able to use it and Thaumaturgy at the same time, but this gives your party better access to guidance. But having Thaumaturgy plus other ways to improve your skill checks means that you're going to be passing those unique Barbarian intimidation checks very frequently, and that can be pretty good because it can get you through a lot of otherwise tricky dialogues. Typically the DCs on those Barbarian Intimidates are very low because the developers don't expect your Barbarian to be very good at making intimidation checks, and so you gain quite a lot of benefit from anything that improves them, whether that be through self-casting Thaumaturgy or having an ally cast guidance on you, and the ability to do both is extremely powerful. This also, of course, gives you just more guidance utility for the rest of your party, as well as all the other utility that you get from a Cleric. Sanctuary is also a spell that you can cast that at level 1 that doesn't require your concentration, can be very useful to help keep an ally alive. So there's a lot of extra utility that you get from a level of Cleric. That said, it's not going to be a tremendous power boost to Barbarian. It doesn't patch any of the main weaknesses of Barbarian, one of which is that it's a class that's requires some extra levels in other classes, and so comes the most barbarian builds come online a little later. Adding in an extra cleric level will delay that, so I think I'm going to rate it B tier. Barbarian and Druid. So this is the basis of the very popular Bear Barbarian or Barbarian build, where you focus on wild shaping and then and raging at the same time. This is very synergistic because rage can give you damage resistances from Bear Totem Rage, which helps you protect your wild shape forms. One of Druid's major weaknesses as a wild shaping combatant is that the wild shapes themselves have pretty weak defenses, relatively low AC, relatively low HP. The damage resistance from Barbarian can help protect your wild shape forms, making you stay in the correct form for much longer, and multiplying the additional hit point bars that you get from Druid significantly. So right away, there's some very powerful synergies between these two classes. I think there's also a couple other ways that you can build these classes, all of which are cool. Like with other other characters, Barbarian gives you gives your Druid. Like with other spellcasters, Barbarian gives your Druid con save proficiency, enabling them to stay concentrating on spells for longer, which is pretty good. And also, unarmored defense does work in your wild shape forms. Now, it's only going to give your wild shape forms like 1 additional AC, because it's based off their constitution, and it basically cancels out the natural armor that those wild shape forms have. So for most forms, it's an increase of like 0 or 1 AC, but still 1 AC plus damage resistances in your wild shape forms is pretty relevant as well. So even just starting your Druid with 1 level of Barbarian can be pretty powerful. Generally, for the unarmored defense version, you're going to want to use Monk because your Druid is going to be maxing out their Wisdom, and so you'll get more additional AC from the Monk's unarmored defense than you will from the Barbarian's unarmored defense, but it's certainly not nothing, and the additional defensive stats that you get from Rage are very powerful to stay in wild shape form. Similarly, the defensive stats are great for multiplying Spore Druid shields, so just like with wild shapes, if you enter Rage and are a Spore Druid, then you can maintain your temporary hit point shields for twice as long because you have damage resistance. Also, the Spore Druid additional damage works with all of the Barbarian special attacks. A Tiger Barbarian can apply the Spore Druid damage across their big AoE swing. So all of those features are very synergistic in and of themselves. However, you are still a Barbarian who's going into a Rage and then maybe cannot cast a spell, and there's a couple downsides that really do hold back the wild shape focused Barbarian multiclasses. One is that going into a Rage can only be done in combat and requires a bonus action, and you won't be able to enter a Rage after wild shaping because of the interface in Baldur's Gate. So you have to stay in humanoid form, enter a Rage, and then wild shape, meaning that you are always wasting your first turn of combat on your bonus action to Rage and then your action to wild shape. Or if you're a Moon Druid, you won't even be able to wild shape until the second turn of combat, because you'll have to do a bonus action Rage, and then cast a spell or take another action, and then enter wild shape with your bonus action in the subsequent turn. Because those two types of actions conflict, it becomes fairly action inefficient, and when you're in Rage, you can't concentrate on a spell. Normally, Druids, especially wild-shaping Druids, play pattern wants to be casting a powerful concentration spell at the beginning of combat, and then maintaining concentration on that spell while attacking in wild shape form. And one of the advantages of, having a more resilient wild shape form that you get from Rage would be to maintain concentration on the spell, but you can't, because you can't concentrate on a spell while raging, so you lose access to a bunch of Druid's best combat options if your primary plan is to enter Rage while in combat. That means that this build is quite powerful, but also somewhat action inefficient, and the game heavily incentivizes that you play for the first round of combat. If you are spending your first round of combat basically passing because you're just self-casting buffs like Rage and Wild Shape, then you are significantly behind other characters who have spent those rounds of combat doing damage, CCing enemies, stopping, repositioning, just doing proactive things rather than things to set up their future turns. Those future turns with this build will be very good, so it's certainly not a bad thing to do by any means, but you do have to spend your first turn of combat entering your combat form, and that's definitely a real downside. Overall, I think this character combination has a lot of cool things going for it, and especially Spore Druid Barbarian is something I'd like to explore a little bit more myself, but the anti-synergy between a spellcasting character and the conflict of action types that this character runs into means I'm going to put it in A tier because it's got very high power level overall, but does suffer a little bit when compared to some of the other characters who are doing their very strong things right from the beginning of a combat. Barbarian and Fighter. I mean, honestly, this one's such a classic, I'm not really sure what to say about it. I think basically every Barbarian build should actually be Barbarian 8, Fighter 4, because these two classes work perfectly together. From Fighter, you get Action Surge. From Barbarian, you get Rage and Reckless Attack. When you're making more attacks, and those attacks are more likely to hit and do more damage, the synergy, of course, is off the charts. Whether you lean more towards Fighter or lean more towards Barbarian with this split is going to depend a little bit on what exactly you're trying to do, but I think unless you're building very specifically a thrower or something like that, this is just an excellent default for every Barbarian-focused character, and for a lot of Fighter-focused characters as well. Whether you're trying to build a tank or just a pure damage dealer, these two classes are going to be a core component of most of those builds. I've done, I don't know, probably half a dozen builds that mix Barbarian and Fighter, maybe more, and you can find those variously scattered across my build videos, including my Karlach tank build, my Minsk lore build, my Karlach lore build. All of those are going to work very well when combining these classes together. In general, there's no level split that you shouldn't take between these two classes, though getting both of them to level 5 is probably not ideal because then you're just doubling up on extra attacks, and so I would generally prefer an 8-4 split between the two of them, one way or the other. 8-4 in favor of Fighter gets you 4 feats, and 8-4 in favor of Barbarian gets you Feral Instinct for a huge initiative boost, as well as just later Barbarian stuff. Either of those are going to be really good. Of course, a 10-2 split just for Action Surge, or a 9-3 split for the Fighter subclasses, as well as Brutal Critical, can be really useful. There's many, many ways you can build this combination. It's such a classic, powerful combination, and honestly, I think is an excellent default if you're considering a melee character. It should be some variety of Barbarian, Fighter, multiclass in general. S tier, obviously, nothing more to say here. This is just so good that it's good in too many ways to talk about. Barbarian and Monk. This is a class combo that I did a build guide on, and I think that's probably the best way to build this class combo. You can find it under the Bare Knuckle Brawler, bear spelled like the animal, of course, because I'm tremendously hilarious. And Barbarian and Monk actually have surprising amounts of synergy. Rage damage does apply to unarmed strikes, so you can be raging and punching at the same time, and if you are one of the more defensively focused barbarians, most notably Bear Totem, but in general, it solves a lot of the squishiness issues that monks suffer from. Monk's main downside as a character is that it is, well, Monk's two main downsides are that it's resource intensive and it's not very forgiving to play, because monks are very squishy and rely on their high mobility in order to stay alive in combat, but so if you make a mistake, it can be a real problem with your monk who's left in a bad situation. Barbarian patches that problem immediately by giving your monk a significant boost to their hit points and resiliency, while also increasing their damage, and it patches the issue where monks are multi-attribute dependent because you get a lot of bonus damage from your rage, so you no longer have to rely exclusively on potions if you want to combine those characters in a way that doesn't just use elixirs all the time. In general, obviously, most monk builds are going to chug elixirs every day, but lots of people don't like to do that, and so this build is one of the ways to do that mitigates the downsides of monk's multi-attribute dependency and lightens their item requirement. That means this build is both pretty powerful and also, I would say, quite versatile because you can fit it more easily into any party than you can just a monoclass monk who requires has pretty strict item requirements in terms of potion consumption and whatever. And so I think that Barbarian and Monk is actually a pretty solid combination if built the way I did in my video. There's a couple other ways to build it too, of course, but mostly what you're going for is a Monk with a splash of Barbarian for a little bit of extra tankiness. The other way around doesn't make that much sense, a Barbarian with a splash of Monk, because Monk as a dip class gives you very little, since almost all of its early class features require you not to be wearing armor, and conflict with Barbarian's class features that require you not to be wearing armor. You get unarmored defense from Monk, but Barbarians already have that, so it's not like you're improving your Barbarian by taking one level of Monk in that way, and unless you're actually making unarmed attacks, and if you are, you should be leveling up Monk, you won't be benefiting from the Monk's other bonuses as a main class Barbarian. So in general, this build I think only has sort of one narrow way to build it, but that way to build it is quite good, so I'm going to rate this class combination A tier, because I think that the build is just very powerful overall, and these two classes, while they don't have a ton of other synergy, combine very well in that way to give your Monk a little bit of extra tankiness and mitigate some of the strict requirements that Monk otherwise has. Barbarian and Paladin. So this is another class combination that I've done a guide for, which you can find under The Zealot of Zariel is the name of that build guide. And this character combination has an amount of synergy that is surprising for for classes that at first glance seem like they won't work very well together. Obviously, when you look at Barbarian, you think they don't work very well as spellcasters. When you look at Paladin, you think their heavy armor fighting style is not going to pair very well with Barbarian's sort of medium armor or unarmored fighting style. But Barbarian actually works to enhance the strengths of Paladin in a really interesting way. Barbarians get reckless attack, and Paladin smites don't count as spells for the purposes of rage. So you can be raging, gaining extra damage and all the great subclass features that Barbarians get when raging, and still make high-level smite attacks as long as you have enough levels of Paladin or other spellcasting classes in order to gain those spell slots. And that will allow you to make reckless attack smites, giving you advantage on every smite attack. Paladins, more than any other class, love advantage because, other than rogues, love advantage because they love landing their one big attack for your smite attack, and they love critically hitting. Advantage almost doubles your chances of getting a critical hit, so it's extremely powerful with smites because critical hits multiply the damage dice that you roll, and smites roll a lot of damage dice. So Barbarian gives you a lot of additional ability to critically hit and a lot of ability to hit just more reliably when you're playing a Paladin. What it doesn't do, this build, is mitigate the downsides of Paladin. It still requires a lot of different attributes, has pretty hefty item requirements, and this also pushes the point at which it comes online back a little bit because you're taking levels in Barbarian and thus not getting spell slots, so you are delaying your spell progression to the higher level smites a little bit. I go over this in quite a bit more detail in the build guide, and I think that build is very, very good, that particular build, but I think these two classes don't combine to be incredible in most circumstances. Only in that build are they particularly good. Given that, I'm going to rate this a solid character class combination because I think there's one build that's very good and a couple other synergies that are useful, but most of the time these two classes are pulling against one another in terms of what they actually want to do, and neither really helps with the downsides of the other class. Barbarians and Paladins are still very Paladins are still very multi-attribute dependent, even when mixed with Barbarian, and you get tankier, but that's not something that Paladins, with Rage, but that's not something that Paladins really have an issue with in general. You also just require very high stats, and each of these character classes wants to be fairly high level to get your good class features. Like, they both want to hit level 7. So you are giving up some of the better class features that each of them have. It can be hard to get all your feats in. In general, I think that this character combination can work in a variety of builds, and in one build is very strong. But overall, I think that this is not a go-to class combination. Probably the only martial class that Barbarian doesn't work extremely well with. B tier overall, but definitely check out that build guide for a great use of this class combo. Barbarian and Ranger. So these are both melee classes and have quite a lot of synergy together. You know, they're both burst damage focused classes. You can use the melee aspect of Ranger rather than the ranged aspect of Ranger and get some fighting styles to go with your Barbarian stuff. Barbarians do very well with just other classes that are focused on putting out initial melee damage. The Gloomstalker initial attack can make up for the fact that Barbarians have to spend a bonus action on raging by giving you a second attack in the early game with, or an additional attack in the beginning of combat. Gloomstalker Ranger is by far the most likely to pair with Barbarian because the other two Rangers really want lots of levels in Ranger in order to shine. Hunter Ranger really needs to hit level 11 in order to do anything, and Beastmaster Ranger needs a lot of levels of Beastmaster because it continues to get strong. That conflicts a little bit with Barbarian, who also wants a lot of levels in the Barbarian class. Normally for Barbarian, you want to hit level 6 for the Wild Heart, animal aspects, or level 7 for Feral Instinct. Generally speaking, you can stop with some subclasses at level 3, but for the most part, both Barbarian and Ranger want a lot of levels in each of those classes. So finding level splits that actually work well between the two of them is somewhat difficult. That said, there are plenty of great builds that work with these two classes. The additional burst damage from Ranger that you get with Barbarian, or the additional tankiness and sustained damage that you get from Barbarian that you can add to Ranger, are really good. It does pull your Ranger away from doing the better thing that Ranger does, because Ranger typically is a much better archer than it is a melee character. Melee Rangers do suffer compared to other melee characters, and Barbarian doesn't really work at ranged. So you do suffer a little bit in comparison by pulling your Ranger away from what the class naturally wants to do, but all the things that Barbarian gives it lets it make up for that. Also, of course, this character combination works really well with levels of another class. You can combine it in addition with Fighter to make a character that really focuses on burst damage and kicking down the door style of play. I think that is one of the builds I did for my Minsk lore-friendly build. And so, like a 3-3 split Barbarian Ranger Fighter, 3-3-6 split with Barbarian Ranger Fighter is really powerful as well. There's a lot of different ways to build this combination, and a lot of additional classes that you can sprinkle in to make it really strong as well. I think that overall, Ranger and Barbarian give you a lot, but the fact that you do give up some of the better features of each class, because those come quite late in the class progression, in order to combine them, holds this character class back, this class combination back a little bit. I'm going to rate it A tier because I think there's a lot of great ways you can build this class combination. The synergy is significant. Additional movement speed from Barbarian works really well with Rangers wanting to just like get into the fight, and the fighting styles are good. But the fact that each of these classes is somewhat backloaded does hold them back a little bit as a pair. So we'll put it in A tier, where I think this is strong, very, very strong in some ways, maybe not quite as versatile as some of the other combinations above it. Barbarian and Rogue. Now, this is obviously a fan favorite, and this is the class combination that just about everyone was picturing when they got really mad that I put Berserker Barbarian in A tier, you know, a very high tier in my class tier list, because Barbarian and Rogue is busted. The way that throwing weapons work in Baldur's Gate means that Berserker Barbarian and Thief Rogue gets to abuse one of the most broken mechanics in the game, using Tavern Brawler, which completely breaks the bounded accuracy system present in Dungeons & Dragons, the design rule that states that you should usually have a chance to miss your attacks. Tavern Brawler in Baldur's Gate breaks that. And when you combine Berserker, Barbarian, and Rogue, you get to throw lots and lots of thrown weapons every turn using the Berserker Barbarian's bonus action throw, which is incredibly powerful and knocks enemies prone, so it does good CC, does great damage. These two classes, I think, benefit the most from multiclassing, because Barbarian wants a couple levels in another class to fix its action economy. Barbarian has a relatively weak action economy because it doesn't give you anything that manipulates it, and has an action economy tax of 1 bonus action when entering combat for the first time in order to enter rage. Rogue needs something to give it raw power, because Rogue has a lot of utility, and with Thief Rogue at least, great action economy, but also with other combinations, lots of utility abilities, but just doesn't get any boosts to its power level after about level 3. That means, because almost all of its power budget is spent on its subclass abilities. That means that together, these characters, Barbarian wants lots of levels and a couple levels in another class to fix its action economy. Rogue wants a few levels and a lot of levels in another class to give it raw power. These characters synergize incredibly. Even outside of the broken throwing build, and obviously the Rogue multiclass with Barbarian is broken. You can check my build guide called the Hulking Hurler for a complete breakdown of that build. Obviously, that's an incredibly busted build, has been since the beginning of the game, even though on Honor Mode they've fixed some of the damage rider issues that were making it even more powerful than it's supposed to be. It is still just a top, 5 build in the game, because the action economy boost from Rogue puts the raw power from Barbarian Thrower just over the top. Even outside of that build, though, these classes have a lot of synergy. The additional bonus action from Rogue, if you're a Thief Rogue, is very powerful because it lets your Barbarian do other stuff on the opening round of combat. Also, just the ability to dash as a bonus action on a Barbarian or get an extra jump, something like that, is really, really good because Barbarian just needs to be next to the enemy that it's fighting, unless you're a thrower, obviously, and Rogue gives you a ton of additional mobility. This also gives you a lot of skills. So remember when I said, it's not terrible to take a level of Bard just for skill access. Rogue gives you all that and a ton of combat power. Even with Assassin Rogue, you gain a lot of additional bonuses. Obviously, you'll have to structure your character slightly differently if you want to make use of the Assassin critical, but that's still just a very good thing to do. You get a guaranteed critical hit with your attack, and then can enter a rage with your bonus action, and then get another attack, because Assassin will give you back your bonus action, so that lets you fix the action economy on Barbarian in another way, because Barbarian gives you effectively an extra bonus action at the start of combat if you do something that requires a bonus action to enter combat. All of those together are just an incredibly powerful set of abilities. Obviously, this class combination is S tier, excuse me. Just did that one just to make all the nerds in the comments really mad. But the main upside of this build, outside of the broken combo, is that these two classes each patch the other's weaknesses perfectly. So even if you discount the incredibly broken combo build, and we shouldn't, because obviously that's a mainstay build for Honor Mode playthroughs, it's an extremely powerful build that works very well with the bonus action throws. Even outside of that, you still get a ton of synergy between these two classes, because each of them fills the hole in the other class perfectly. Everyone, be cool in the comments about that one as well. Barbarian and Sorcerer. So Barbarian and Sorcerer obviously at first glance look like they're going to have no synergy whatsoever. It's a spellcasting class, and perhaps the most spellcasting of the spellcasting classes, paired with Barbarian, who turns off spellcasting, which obviously is significant anti-synergy. Also, Sorcerers already have Constitution saving throws, so the 1-level dip that you might consider for some other casters to gain con saves from Barbarian doesn't work for Sorcerers, and Draconic Sorcerers can already effectively get unarmored defense because they have mage armor on all the time, basically. So you aren't gaining a lot of things that these classes don't already have from a lot of those aspects of those characters. However, I think that the other direction actually is a relatively interesting build. Taking Barbarian with a 1-level Sorcerer dip can offer some pretty interesting effects. 1-level Sorcerer dip is excellent because it gives you a ton of utility spells and a bunch of really powerful abilities. Most notably with Storm Sorcerer and any ritual spell, you get infinite out of combat flying. And Barbarian is a really mobility-hungry class, so the ability to cast a spell and then use your bonus action to fly, even though that will eat your bonus action, is something that you can use pretty reliably in combat. Not something that's going to come up that often, because your Barbarian is going to have a lot of ability to jump, so normally you'll be able to make most of those flights with a jump, but infinite out of combat flying isn't worthless. You also get Friend, which, just like I talked about with Clerics, is a valuable boost to Barbarian's unique Intimidate abilities. You have to be a little bit more careful using Friends than using Thaumaturgy, because Friends will provoke a reaction from enemies. It'll count as criminality, so you either have to be careful where you use it or leave the area immediately after using it. But again, a small piece of synergy between these two characters. And finally, you get something that is definitely a bug, but is too powerful not to mention, and that is Shield. In Baldur's Gate, you can cast Shield, the spell Shield, while raging. You shouldn't be able to, because it's a spell, but the way that it works is you can cast Shield while raging, and that is very powerful as well. The ability to block attacks, and remember that Barbarians are often going to be the focus of most enemy attacks, so the ability to prevent those from hitting you is pretty valuable, and something that both like Light Cleric and Sorcerer add to this class. Is this a build that I would recommend going frequently? Probably not, because you're doing, you're putting your level in Sorcerer in for a few minor benefits, but the addition of Friends, Shield, a bunch of dialogue skills, and infinite out-of-combat flight is definitely not nothing for a Barbarian, and can give you a lot of additional utility. I think that this is an extremely niche build, and one that you will want to do based on flavor or just wanting those abilities, but it's not zero utility, and so it's something that I'm going to put in C tier, a niche build, but one with some applications. Barbarian and Warlock. So this is going to differ significantly depending on whether you're playing on Honor Mode or whether you're playing on Tactician or below. Because on Tactician or below, the Blade Pact Warlock's extra attack stacks with all other sources of extra attack for a third attack in a round. That includes Barbarian, so 7 levels of Warlock, or so a 7-5 split between the two of them gets you 3 attacks in a round and is very powerful. Obviously, 3 attacks in a round is really, really good, and so even with two classes that otherwise don't have that much synergy, on Tactician or below, this is a pretty powerful combination just because that's such a powerful effect. 3 attacks in a round is really good. Also, making your attack charisma-based is not terrible. It gives you some additional options in terms of itemization, lets you be a party face, and so on. So Blade Pact Barbarian, Blade Pact Warlock synergizes with Barbarian in some ways in that way. On Honor Mode, it's different, because you just don't get the extra attack, and so we have to look at what these classes actually give to one another. Like all spellcasters, Warlock can benefit from 1 level of Barbarian to gain Constitution save proficiencies, and to gain unarmored defense, letting you set your con pretty high and be in robes. And since Warlocks, more than even any other caster class, really want to be in a robe because the potent robe is so powerful, the unarmored defense from Barbarian is actually quite valuable for a Warlock, and something that you should definitely consider. This is you can get Reckless Attack and Rage combined with your Pact of the Blade attacks, if that's something that you're interested in. Combined with Unarmored Defense, this can make your character pretty tanky. That said, Warlock's main things are Darkness, which you can't concentrate on when you're raging, and Eldritch Blast, which you can't use when you're raging. So Warlock is not getting any benefit from Rage, unlike any of the other caster classes. So really it's just, do you want to use Barbarian or do you want to use Fighter to gain, or Sorcerer to gain con save proficiency if you're taking this for a Warlock? Almost always you'll take it on Sorcerer you'll take a level of Sorcerer to gain con save proficiency alongside Shield and a bunch of other great utility, rather than taking Barbarian or Fighter for your Warlock at level 1. But Barbarian's not a terrible option. For splashing Warlock into a Barbarian build, I just don't think that it gives you anything. You gain way more utility and better like dialogue skills and so on from getting from Cleric or Sorcerer levels. The Blade Pact attacks with charisma are not particularly good for barbarians because you'd rather just be using strength anyways. I think that the synergies here are just too infrequent and far between. It is maybe possible you could do something interesting with a Warlock, Barbarian, and Paladin multiclass, where you can use your Warlock spell slots for smites rather than just while in rage. But I think that in Baldur's Gate, where you only get 12 levels, that would just come online way too late, and you wouldn't get high enough level spell slots. Something for me to think about later, possibly. But overall, I think that this build combination is just pretty niche, and I'm going to place it in C tier, because I just don't think that there's much that it gives you for an honor mode build that you don't get better from other classes. Barbarian and Wizard. So once again, this is Barbarian plus a spellcasting character, and that gives you some inherent anti-synergy, of course, because you cannot cast spells while raging. But just like all other spellcasting characters except sorcerers, the Barbarian gives you con save proficiency and unarmored defense for your wizard, and both of those are pretty powerful. And also, I think that there is a unique and interesting build here, which I'm definitely going to do a guide on, where you can use Abjuration Wizard plus Barbarian's Bear Totem Rage to make your character basically invincible, because having incoming damage, getting resistance to all incoming damage, and then having the damage reduction from Abjuration Wizard sounds like a character that basically can't die. Outside of that build, and I haven't yet explored that build, so keep an eye out for a build guide to that if it works out to actually be good and interesting. Outside of that build, though, you're just doing the very classic thing of one level of Barbarian at the beginning of a caster build to get unarmored defense and to get con save proficiency, and that's a totally reasonable thing to do, a niche build, but again, one that lets you spend one level to still get full spell casting with 11 levels of Wizard and get unarmored defense and con save proficiency. Together, those things are not enough to justify this being outside of C tier, but definitely enough to justify it being outside of D tier. So I'm going to rate this a C tier build. More interesting for the 1 level of Barbarian, 11 levels of Wizard build than the Wizard wants 1 level of Barbarian in a way that Sorcerer doesn't, but Barbarian wants 1 level of Sorcerer much more than it wants 1 level of Wizard. Obviously, a level of Sorcerer is better because you get all the Charisma skills and everything instead of the Wizard skills. Wizard's normal power as a 1 level dip doesn't apply to Barbarian unless you're going for a very odd split with Barbarian and another spellcaster, but it's possible that you can do something there and get some pretty high level spells from scrolls while still having a couple Barbarian things. Overall, though, I think in general you're just going to mostly avoid this character combination, except for 1 level of Barbarian to give your wizard con save proficiency. Alright, so that's every Barbarian multiclass combination. I'm going to leave this tier list on the screen for a little while, so if you want to take a screenshot or whatever, then definitely go ahead and just talk about the lessons from Barbarian multiclassing for a moment. So Barbarians, as you can see, benefit really powerfully from classes that can help fix their action economy. Barbarians have nothing inherently that increases their action economy and have an action economy penalty, so classes like Fighter or Rogue that add action economy to your arsenal, or indeed Gloomstalker Ranger, are really powerful with Barbarian. Additionally, Barbarian offers a lot of tankiness to other melee builds, and so that can give you some additional potency when you're going for a tank build with Druid or Monk, and those builds are also very good. Together, that gives you a lot of power when you are trying to multiclass Barbarian, because it wants just a few levels of a lot of other classes and benefits really strongly from a 1-level dip or 2-level dip, 3-level dip in a couple other classes to generate the most power that your character can have. It also functions really well as a 1 or 2-level dip in a bunch of builds, whether that be with Paladin to give yourself reckless attack on your smites, whether that be with a spellcaster to gain unarmored defense. You can work in 1 level of Barbarian into a lot of other builds and benefit pretty strongly. Overall, Barbarian, I think, is the class that benefits the second most from multiclassing of any of the classes, and I think it is a very rare Barbarian build that shouldn't at least strongly consider being paired with Rogue or Fighter, because those classes are just so synergistic. Alright, let's talk about Bard multiclasses. So Bard is obviously an incredible base class and doesn't really need multiclassing in order to be extraordinarily powerful. So the trick when you are trying to multiclass Bard is to try not to dilute the power level of your Bard too much by gaining only things that you actually need and not taking stuff that Bard doesn't already give you. Since Bard basically gives you some of everything already, you need to be a little bit judicious with how you multiclass it in order not to take away or just not add something that's stronger than what you're already doing. However, bards will often multiclass for a couple reasons. One is to increase the damage that your sword bard is doing by multiclassing with a martial character to gain the additional martial value from martial characters' class abilities. Two is to add in something like con save proficiency or armor proficiencies into a caster bard in order just to make them more resilient. Or three is to add a bunch of utility to another class. A 1 or 2 level bard dip for another class is always good because it's always going to give you decent skill proficiencies. 2 levels gets you Song of Rest, which, depending on how often you long rest, is an extremely powerful ability in Baldur's Gate, and one that you should definitely be taking advantage of. So there's a lot of different reasons to pick up Bard, and also, of course, Jack of all trades is very good for your skill monkey. In general, you can benefit quite heavily from just a 1 or 2 level dip in Bard for another class. Obviously, we've already covered Bards and Barbarians, which I placed in C tier, so let's move on to Bards and Clerics. Clerics are the best 1 level dip in the game, and so bards who want a 1 level dip in something that patches their weaknesses benefit extremely strongly from taking a 1 level dip in Cleric. Cleric gives you just about, in a single level, gives you just about everything that bard is missing. You get heavy armor and shield proficiencies and martial weapon proficiencies if you want those. You get access to a bunch of additional healing if you want extra healing from Life Cleric. You get guidance, making your already extremely reliable skills even more reliable. You get thaumaturgy, making your already reliable dialogue skills even more reliable. Altogether, that gives you a ton of additional utility, as well as adding in healing word, sanctuary, and just massive amounts of extra power from only a single level of Cleric. But 11 levels of Bard and 1 level of Cleric is my pick for just how you should build Bards in general. It's one of the most powerful builds in the entire game, and definitely something that you should be keeping in mind always as an option. It gives you tremendous amounts of utility, fixes all the problems that caster Bards already have, and just works very well. You can also do it in reverse. You can put a couple levels of Bard into your Cleric build to give them a lot of skills, give them dialogue skills, something like that. And that works very well. You can give your clerics good reactions if you take 3 levels of Bard. It does cost you 6 level spell slots, but if you take 3 levels of Bard to gain cutting words, then suddenly your cleric has really good reactions. Reactions are something that clerics, except for light clerics, are normally missing a really good one, so adding in cutting words into that build is obviously really good. Generally speaking, the way that you're going to build this character is going to be 1 level dip in either direction, but there are also combinations you can do with more involved level splits with this build, and the fact that that each of these classes patches all of the others' weaknesses in basically just 1 level means that these 2 classes are just made for each other. Clerics and Bards are S tier, of course, one of my favorite multi-class combinations in the game, and a class combo that you should almost certainly always consider when you are building either of these characters. Bard and Druid. So I decided to go back and re-record this because I actually forgot one possible combination here, so you'll see it in the wrong place in the fighter segment, but it should be right after the fighter segment. And then, of course, this is correct. This is just me from the future checking in to let you know that there will be a slight inconsistency. So Bard and Druid are a character combo that doesn't have a lot of synergy sort of at first glance, because they're both casters that really want to reach later levels. Bard really wants to hit at least level 6 in order to gain their powerful class features. Druid wants to hit at least level 7, usually even level 9, to get access to their best spells, because unlike most full casters, Bard's best spells are actually their level 4 and 5 spells in Conjure Woodland Being and Conjure Elemental, and so getting access to your high-level spells as a caster druid is really important. However, there's one combination that actually works really well with these two, and that's using them as a martial combination, because Bard gets Swords Bard, which makes lots and lots of attacks, and Druid gets Spore Druid, which adds damage to every attack that you make. The addition of that damage to all of your Sword Bard attacks is very powerful, and when you're making so many attacks in a round, even just the extra d6 adds up pretty quickly. Overall, I think that that version of the build is very good. And while outside of that, there aren't a ton of uses for that, and I also don't think that's the best multiclass for Swords Bard. It's a good multiclass, but Swords Bard has better options. I think overall I'm going to put this character combo in B tier because it gives you some really solid additional damage for a Swords Bard specifically, and of course one level of Bard for a Druid is really good because it gives you a lot of skills, so just like every other character, you can benefit from one level of Bard. But overall, the two classes don't have much synergy and don't work super well together. A lot of the things that you want to do with Druid, you can't easily do when you are multiclass with Bard. Bard does give you some good concentration spells to concentrate on in Wild Shape, but then you're not hitting your third attack because you're not getting to level 10 with your Druid. So it is, like if you take 6 levels of Bard, for example, to get access to Spirit Guardians or something like that, a concentration spell that you can concentrate on in Wild Shape, then you won't hit level 10 in your Druid build, so you are not going to be doing as much. I think that there's a couple really interesting options here, so I'm going to place this character combo in B tier, but overall I think it is just not as strong as multiclassing Bard with most other full casters or most martial classes, because the two classes just pull in different directions. Still, it can be a very solid character, but you have to build it in a pretty particular way. Bard and Fighter. So you're going to be hearing this a lot when we get to the Fighter sections, but Fighter pairs incredibly with everything. In fact, I'd be very surprised if any of the Fighter multiclasses come in under A tier, and it's very possible that every Fighter multiclass will come in at S tier, because Fighter at level 2, very early in the build, gets the single most powerful class feature in the game in Action Surge. Action Surge just gives you a whole extra action, which you can use to make attacks, or cast spells, do whatever, and that is so powerful and so valuable for every type of character that basically any character can benefit from a 2-level Fighter dip. The natural way to pair Fighter and Bard is going to be with a Swords Bard, benefiting from the martial aspects that Fighter gives you, the heavy armor, the martial weapons, the Action Surge, of course, and as well as the fighting style. But there are, even if we discount that combination, and much like Barbarian and Rogue, the top combination of these two classes is one of the top combinations in the game. Fighter and Swords Bard combined is just a very, very powerful meta build that sits atop the Honor Mode metagame. But even if we discount that build, and we shouldn't because it's incredibly strong and a great combination of these two classes still have a lot of synergy even outside of that broken use case. Adding in Action Surge to your Bard gives them the ability to make cast multiple spells in a turn, which is very valuable, especially because the way that you're starting most of your combats with Bard is by casting a powerful concentration spell, and so that will let you do that and then also do another spell during the fight. It also lets you, before you get the Band of the Mystic Scoundrel, do like an attack and then a control spell with your Swords Bard, if that's something that you're interested in doing. And so those two use cases together are already extremely powerful. Fighter also gives you con save proficiency, very useful for any casting class, especially Bard, who wants to maintain concentration. And on the converse, Bard gives Fighter a bunch of skill access. One of the weaknesses of Fighter is that you lose out on skills, and Bard can fix that entirely. And if you want your party face to be a Fighter, then a Bard level will do that for you very well. In fact, 1 level of Bard and 11 levels of Fighter is still great because it gets you all the skills that you might want alongside a bunch of utility, while also still hitting 11 levels of Fighter, and getting your third attack. So because it's just a 1-level dip, you aren't losing the main draw of Fighter if you do it in that order. In either direction, this is a very powerful class combination. Mostly you'll be dipping 2 levels of Fighter into Bard, or 3 levels of Fighter for Battlemaster Fighter with your Swords Bards. And regardless of how you do it, that's going to be a very powerful build. In fact, another option is to go to 3 levels and get Eldritch Knight, because Eldritch Knight gives you shield, and that is a pretty good way to add shield into your build. 3 levels of Eldritch Knight plus shield is very powerful, and that gives bards yet another powerful reaction, something that they definitely want as well. So there's a lot of different level splits you can take with this class combination, and both of these classes give you so much at level 1 that just 1 level dips between the two of them are very powerful. I think this is obviously an S tier class combination. If Sword Bard didn't exist, I think this would probably sit in A tier, but might still be S tier. So either way, Fighter and Bard is a great combination to pay attention to, and definitely one that you should consider whenever you're building either. Bard and Monk. So this is our first set of characters that actually have almost no synergy with one another, because each of these characters just wants to do extremely different things. Monk obviously wants to make unarmed attacks, and Bard, if you're Swords Bard, wants to make weapon attacks. So the two martial versions of the characters don't work very well together. Also, Monk needs 5 of the 6 attributes, or 4 of the 6 attributes, to be very high, all 4 at once. And one of the only 2 attributes they don't need is Charisma, which obviously bards need for a lot of their effects. This means that monks actually make pretty bad party faces, so even the use of 1 level of bard to gain skills on your monk is one thing that is probably worse than it would be for other classes. All that said, of course, 1 level of bard is still just very good, so it's not something that you will necessarily have a problem with, and the prevalence of stat items in the game does make it more possible to have a monk be a party face, something that in a game that didn't have elixirs and the gloves of dexterity and whatever would be basically impossible, is something that you can sometimes get away with in Baldur's Gate, and if you do want to do that, then a level of Bard is pretty good. Inspiration dice are also not terrible for monks, just giving out some support to their party. One thing that monks normally don't bring to the table is any form of healing or support or anything like that, so a couple levels of Bard can help with that. And Song of Rest synergizes very well with monk, because they're a very, very short rest-dependent class that needs lots of resources, so the ability to gain extra short rests is very good. Obviously, you'd usually rather have this on a party member than have it on yourself, because then you're spending 2 levels on Bard, which doesn't give you that much, but that's still a solid use for the character. So overall, I'm going to, even though these 2 classes have very little synergy with one another, place this as a niche build. Again, we are going to see almost no D tier classes we'll probably see no D tier classes for Bard, because 1 level of Bard at the start of 11 levels of something else is always good, so it's very hard for a Bard multiclass to be totally useless. Bard and Paladin. So one thing that we're going to see as we come back to these Charisma classes over and over again is that all 4 of the Charisma classes multiclass extremely well with one another in just about every possible combination. These classes, the 4 Charisma classes, can be combined with basically any combination of pairs or multiples of classes in any split of levels between them, and you'll end up with a solid functional character. Bard and Paladin is no exception. The ability to gain high-level spell slots from Bard in order to make your smite attacks, or the ability to add smites into your Sword Bard's arsenal, are both incredibly strong things that add a ton of extra stuff to your character. The 2 classes also patch one another's weaknesses perfectly. Paladin normally has relatively weak skill access, Bard fixes that. Bard normally has relatively weak defenses, Paladin fixes that. Bard normally suffers from needing to make lots of attacks to gain high damage. If you're a Swords Bard, you don't have just like 1 powerful attack. Paladin totally fixes that because it lets you spend your spell slots. You also get access to a bunch of extra utility from each of these classes that's extremely powerful. There's lots of different builds you can make. You could do a caster build focused around the Paladin auras. You can, especially if you're using elixirs, then you can have high charisma and high strength. You can do a sword bard build focused around smites. You can do paladin, basically a paladin build, but with extra skill points and higher level spell slots. You can do a paladin build, but with reactions from Lord Bard. All of these are incredibly powerful options. All of them will be extremely powerful. Honestly, there's not that much to say about this class combination because it's just too good, and there's almost no ways you can build it that it won't be good. Check out any of my build guides on these on this class combination for more detailed builds, but obviously this is an S tier combination. Bard and Ranger. So this is another combination that's sort of carried by the existence of Sword Bard, but Bard and Ranger work extremely well together in that context because Ranger patches some of the few weaknesses that Sword Bard has, or I guess enhances its strengths more like. The addition of archery fighting style allows you to more reliably land your sharpshooter shots, and the addition of the Gloomstalker extra attack means that you are doing even more burst damage at the beginning of combat, something that is, of course, incredible for Sword Bard. More attacks also lets you stack up your arcane acuity if that's something that you're abusing even faster, and so Sword Bard and Ranger works extremely well together in that context. Ranger also works pretty well with Bard just as by default, again because the skill access is good. Although Rangers don't need the skill access as much as other characters do, because Rangers also already have pretty good skill access. So they don't benefit quite as much as Bards as other martial characters do from taking a level of Bard at the beginning. Mostly then we're looking at the Sword Bard multiclass, and I think that there are better characters to pair with Sword Bard in general, but this is still the basis of an extremely strong and powerful build. The fact that there is basically only one way to combine these classes means I'm going to put them in A tier, although obviously the Sword Bard Ranger combination is incredibly strong, so it is as powerful as the S tier classes, but just less versatile. There's fewer ways to combine these, because you're basically just using it with Gloomstalker Ranger to make extra attacks with Sword Bard. In particular, powerful when combined with Battlemaster Fighter or with Assassin Rogue, which we'll talk about next. Bard and Rogue. Now these are both skill-focused characters, and so you might think that there's not a ton of synergy because they each get all the skills that they want baked into their class. But the ability to add expertise to all of your skills, from taking levels in Rogue and levels in Bard together, means that you can have a character that has skill expertises out the wazoo and end up being able to pass every skill check extremely reliably. Aside from that, also, in combat, Bard and Rogue obviously have tons of synergy, especially with Swords Bards, but also with any form of Bard. The ability to add extra stealth and utility to all of your caster Bards is actually very good. The additional offhand attack from Thief Bard is very good, the additional critical hit from Assassin Bard is very good for Swords Bards, but also the ability to just have a bonus action dash at level 2 Rogue, plus an additional dash at level 3 is really nice for lore bards or any other form of bard that you want. If you're looking for a support and utility character, you can't really go wrong with a thief rogue added to just about any other character. And so this is really good even outside of the broken combination with Sword Bard, which obviously is one of the highest damage builds in the game. So again, we shouldn't discount that build, but the fact that we can discount that build and still end up with an extremely powerful class combination means this is obviously S tier. There are lots and lots of different fun ways to build this character. Check out my build, The Best Healer in Baldur's Gate, for one fun and unique way to combine Rogue and Bard that isn't a Swords Bard build. And there's just so many different options that you get from having the extra bonus action from Thief Rogue that it is just very powerful to add that into just about any build. So even outside of the extremely broken builds that you can do with Assassin and Swords Bard, or offhand attacks with Thief and Swords Bard, you can still just benefit really powerfully from adding in a few levels of Rogue to any Bard character, or vice versa, in order to gain better skill access as well as better skill access and expertise, as well as the utility that each of these classes brings to the other. Just a great combination. Each of these patches weaknesses that the other class has and plays off one another's strength. S tier character combo. Bard and Sorcerer. So this is another combo that benefits very strongly from one-level dips, because a one-level dip of Sorcerer into Bard fixes most of the problems that the Bard has. If you begin your Bard character with a level of Sorcerer, you get con save proficiency, you get shield, and you get flight, because if you use Storm Sorcerer, you get to fly as a bonus action whenever you cast a spell, as well as fly an unlimited amount when outside of combat. All of those are incredibly powerful. I think a little bit worse than the Cleric dip just because the AC that you get from Cleric is really good, but they're very, very close. Like, the margins are razor thin between those, and I think you can do extremely well with a one-level initial dip into Cleric, or a one-level dip into Cleric, or a one-level dip into Sorcerer. The one reason I think that the Cleric dip is a little better is that the Sorcerer level has to go at level 1, so it costs you the skills that Bard gets, which is one of the awesome things that Bard gets, whereas the Cleric dip can come later in the build. That being said, that's an incredible build. You can also do the reverse, of course, although you lose one of the main things that Sorcerers get, which is their con save proficiency, so that does hold that the one level of Bard dip back a little bit, but these characters also combine extremely well with one another, just in sort of any level combination, because meta magic is really good for any other sort of caster. Bards get a lot of great spells and a lot of great utility. I think overall this character combination is one that is mostly carried by the one level sorcerer dip for Bard, but there are lots of different Bard sorcerer combos that you can build. The fact that you don't get high-level spell access does hold these characters back, because both of them want to reach very high-level spells, so if you do a mix and match with sort of an even split, like 5 to 7 levels of each of them, then you're going to end up with a sort of weird build where you're not getting maybe the spells that you really, really want at high levels. But the ability to add meta magic to any of your lower-level spells, to have the powerful concentration spells that each of these gives you, is nice. I think that most of the time you build these characters, it's going to be taking one level of Sorcerer and then a bunch of levels of Bard, but that's just a really good build. So I'm going to put this build in A tier, because I think that it is really, really powerful to take one level of Sorcerer, but that is more or less the only way you're going to build this character combination. Though there's probably some other options that are really fun as well, and definitely one that's more worth exploring. I think together these characters are the two charisma-based characters that synergize the least, but that should tell you something because they still land in A tier. Bard and Warlock. So all the charisma characters, of course, are great together, so it will come as no surprise to you that I think this character combo is awesome. The trick here is that Blade-Packed Warlock can set your weapon attacks to use charisma, meaning that now you're using charisma for your weapon attacks as well as for your spellcasting, both with your Warlock spells and with your Bard spells. On Tactician or below, if you take 5 levels of Blade-Packed Warlock and at least 6 levels of Swords Bard, or Valor Bard, I guess, but that's not really a thing, then you get 3 attacks, so you can even benefit from that. But even without that on Honor Mode, you can gain a character that just uses one stat, becomes extremely single attribute dependent, which is awesome, to do some of the most powerful things in the game. This character combo has the best access possible to the Arcane Acuity and Mystic Scoundrel Ring combo that is incredibly broken and one of the most powerful things you can possibly do in Honor Mode. But even outside of Arcane Acuity, which is just a broken mechanic in general, this character is going to be doing so much and with so little effort that it's just extremely powerful. It requires basically no items to succeed, because you can use any different weapon, no specific items, you can use any weapon with your packed Warlock, as long as you're proficient in it, and it will use your charisma, so it doesn't matter what weapon type you use, so you can fit it into any party. It's got incredible access to charisma skills and just skills in general between this character combination. You also get access to one of the most broken mechanics in the game, the Darkness and Devil Sight combo, so you're using like several of the most broken possible mechanics between these two classes, and also each of them synergizes incredibly well with the other. Even if you weren't going for a Blade Warlock, then you can gain a lot of benefit just from a 1 level of Fiend Warlock for a Bard, because access to command on a Bard is incredibly strong. Or I should say, you can also, in addition to going Blade Warlock, use 1 level of Fiend Warlock and get access to Command. Command on a Bard is broken, especially when you're doing everything with your Charisma. And even outside of Blade Warlock, the other two Warlocks add a bunch of extra utility to the Bard. The Familiar is really good for you. The Tome Warlock is a little bit less good because you already have a lot of those spells, but Guidance on a Warlock is still just really good. Guidance on a Bard is still just really good because you're just really good at casting spells. Altogether, you can build this class in any number of ways, and it will be incredibly strong. It's also some of the most broken builds in the game, and so obviously this character combination is S tier. I think that you could basically throw a dart at a board randomly and choose your level split between these two classes completely at random, and you would end up with an extremely powerful character. Bard and Wizard. So I'm a little torn on how to rate Wizard multiclasses with other casters, because the way that Wizard multiclasses with other casters in Baldur's Gate is a little bit broken and sort of an exploit, and based on a very odd rules interpretation that nobody normally plays with, that I'm surprised they didn't take out of the game or remove for honor mode. But basically in Baldur's Gate, the way that Wizard works is as long as you have one level of Wizard, you can learn spells from scrolls up to your total caster level, not your Wizard level. So taking one level of Wizard on any other caster class gets you access to the entire Wizard spell list for free. Now these will be cast using your, or I guess not for free, at the cost of one level. But these will be cast using your intelligence, so you're mostly going to be using it for utility spells, or you're going to be using your main class for utility, building for intelligence, and I've done builds that do both of these. But the addition of every single wizard spell, including all the secret spells and everything, to any caster class is going to be ludicrously powerful. That said, it feels a little cheesy because it is based on a weird rules interpretation that I'm certain should not be in the game, and that they said at various points was a bug that they intended to fix, but didn't decided, I think have at this point clearly decided not to fix it. And so whether we should count that or not is something that I think is interesting to consider. I've decided for this tier list that I am going to count that application, because that is the state of the game that we're playing. Just because it's a little bit cheesy or a little bit exploity or based on a weird rules interpretation doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And the fact is that they know it has existed and have said that they intended to fix it, and then have gone back on whether they intended to fix it. And they released Honor Mode, which is sort of the like definitive mode for the game, without fixing it. So I think it's pretty clearly intended that wizards just get to learn all the scrolls. I just wanted to talk about that a little bit before we actually judge this character combo. Now, a bard with all of the wizard spells, obviously that's great. One of the things that bards are missing is some of the powerful utility spells that you can get from wizard. And even though bards get magical secrets, more spells is just always good. Getting access to a ton of additional utility spells from wizard levels is awesome. Also, the reverse is true too. If you want to just take utility spells from Bard and use your wizard spells offensively, that's also a great option and very powerful. Either way, when you do this, you're going to be making an already incredible class even better by splashing in just all the power from another whole class. You're basically, whenever you take one wizard level on a caster, playing two characters at once, and two characters at once is very strong. So obviously this is an S tier build. If wizard didn't give you all of the wizard spells from scrolls, then I think I would probably place it in B tier, because it's still a reasonable 1-level dip. You can, or 2-level dip for like divination wizard is pretty nice. For a bard, just getting access to a lot of additional utility spells at level 1, and then the divination bonuses are really good as well. But as is, obviously, we can't rate it anything other than S tier, because you basically spend 1 level to get access to 50 more spells, and that is an incredible amount of value for what you're doing. So S tier character combination. Alright, my friends, I will once again leave this up on screen in case you want to screenshot it or anything like that, and this will be it for this video because it's already way over an hour. I know it looks like we've only gotten through 2 classes, but remember, each subsequent class is going to have fewer and fewer combinations because we'll already have covered some, so we've done 21 of the 66 possible combinations, so we're almost a third of the way through. And the lesson here with Bard is that what you've got from Bard is just it's such a good class already, and so much of its power is packed in so early that it combines extremely well with just about every other possible character class. And it also is a class where it has so much power that in the things that it's good at, but is missing just a couple things, that the ability to patch those weaknesses with one level of, say, Cleric or Sorcerer or whatever, adds a ton of additional utility to Bards, and makes them just one of the easiest classes to multiclass and to fit into any party. Alright, my friends, I hope that you've enjoyed this video, and of course, as always, if you have, then feel free to leave a comment. Let me know if you think I got any of these wrong, you'd like to move any of these multi-class combos around, or if there's something you think I should do differently for next time. I'm always open for feedback. And of course, if you have enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe for more of this, Baldur's Gate build guides, and other strategy game content. Cheers, my friends. I'll catch you next time.